Hey, I'm Carl. This is my Lingo Kingdom, and I am here with Ben Llywelyn to talk about language learning, especially our shared love of Celtic languages. So, welcome to the channel, Ben. Croeso.
Diolch, thank you.
So, some people who watch my channel probably have seen you and your videos before, but for people who haven't, I'd love for you to give like a quick intro of who you are and what your channel is about.
Okay, yeah, so my channel is Ben Llywelyn, and we'll put a link down there below if you to Llywelyn is a bit of a speller for a lot of people. And I focus on languages, but I also delve into wider Western culture and humanities generally, but focusing more on Wales because that's what I know more about. And the Welsh language, I've got quite a few videos on teaching the Welsh language. And right now I'm going through a Welsh history series from the very start of history, just before Rome, all the way up to the end of the 20th century. That's going to be taking up the next couple months at least, with lots and lots of videos on Welsh history going on.
Yeah. Well, I've got to say, I've watched several of those, and they're so enjoyable. I really like how in depth you go with those.
Well,
So, when or how did you become interested in learning languages?
um, I don't know, it's so gradual. I grew up in Texas, really on the edge of the Spanish speaking culture. And my father remarried with a Honduran woman. And I had Spanish all around me, and I didn't become fluent in Spanish, but I did reach a point where I can kind of understand what people are saying. And I think as I traveled later in life, I became familiar with especially Latin based languages, Romance languages, and that's because of that early influence that I had. And my grandmother's family had a bit of German language in the background.
Okay.
So I did grow up with a multilingual experience, and I think that affected me. I also had some faint interactions with Czech and Hebrew as a young kid in Texas. So that influenced me a lot. And I was writing when I was younger, and I guess that's linguistic. But the love of the Celtic languages came later, I think. Um,
Okay. So, had you already like started to study languages before you started to study Welsh, or was it just that kind of peripheral exposure before you started studying Welsh?
I had studied poetry, and I think the fact that Welsh has a many centuries long poetry tradition, ACAT, is it was one appeal to me.
Hmm.
I did touch on Scots Gaelic briefly, but I know you're getting into that, which that's one thing that fascinates me about your channel is you seem to be going more into that than I did. Um,
Hmm.
but I liked that Welsh has a simple orthography. Once you know how it's pronounced, you
Yeah.
don't have to worry about it. With Scots Gaelic, it seems a bit it's a bit more involved.
That's what I keep telling people. They're like, Welsh, how do you pronounce all those D's and L's? And I'm like, hey, it's like the Spanish of the Celtic languages. If you know how it's spelled, you know how to say it. It's way easier than Gaelic. And then
Yeah,
people just kind of look at me like, okay, you're crazy.
yeah. I'll just tell people I learned Welsh because I was lazy.
Kind of where you're at now, what languages do you speak until kind of what level, on like an average?
Okay, so
Because you're learning
I'm,
several at once, like me.
I don't tend to actually. I
Okay,
go through
okay.
phases of my life. So Spanish, I've got kind of a background, subconscious kind of knowledge, but I've never studied it or spoken it extensively. I could get by if I was in Spain. That wouldn't be a problem.
Hmm. Okay,
But
yeah.
I don't claim that I can speak it. Um, Welsh, I'm fluent. That's pretty much the language of my home, basically. French, I can speak, I can get by in fine. I can read it. I watch films and stuff. I don't need too many subtitles usually in French, so I'm at that level.
Hmm.
Dutch, I don't claim that I can speak it, but if you speak to me like a child, like we can have a conversation. And if so, I watch like children's level news in Dutch. Yeah, and so I can get that. If I know the subject and the context and it's simple, then I can get by in Dutch. That gives me a bit of access into German,
Hmm.
right? Um, I did do a bit of Scots Gaelic, but I'm guessing that you are more advanced at that now than I am because I
Okay.
just did it for a brief bit, like 15 years ago.
Okay.
And I know a bit of Hebrew. Um, I can't speak it, but I know how to pronounce it. I know how the shape of the language works. I know the basic grammar. Um, but really, in terms of being able to speak, I'm going to have to limit myself probably just French, maybe Spanish, and definitely Welsh.
Okay. So I would love for you to talk more about your background in Welsh because, grew up in Texas, now you're living in Wales. You actually studied Welsh in Wales. Can you
Yes,
tell us about kind of how you decided, what? Not only am I going to live here, I'm gonna become fluent in this language and get a degree in it.
I was married. Um, at the time, the United States would not let me marry my then partner, who was English, and so we had to move over to the United Kingdom. And then I came over here, but I was already having an interest in Welsh by this point before I ever came over here. I never thought it would become anything. I never thought that I could make any kind of career or study it. But as life happened, I moved to London and I met then a Welsh teacher who I built a friendship with. And we were speaking Welsh over the course of a couple years. And later on, I moved closer to Wales on the other side of England. And I decided to then, after a few more years, decided to go and study Welsh. Um, I didn't have a career plan. I just kind of followed what was interesting, and I went down more the medieval route and the poetry route, as I mentioned before, the poetry and the history. And I studied at
Mhm.
Bangor up in Gwynedd, which is more Welsh speaking, and I lived in Welsh speaking environments for a while.
You were saying that you studied Welsh and then went more into the medieval side. So that means what was your bachelor's and then what was your master's in?
Okay, so my bachelor's was just Cymraeg, Welsh as a subject, and then I went and did a master's in MPhil actually in Cambridge, where I studied basically medieval Welsh royal court propaganda and poetry, and how when the Norman French came in, see the French connection there,
Yeah.
how it influenced Wales. And this really got me interested then in French. And so I had begun studying French years before, but then this really developed it when I was learning about how the Norman conquest came into Wales and words changed, especially for architecture, weaponry, and kind of financial technology, I guess you could say. And so learning French then changed me again because I thought, well, I've learned Welsh and French. Maybe I could begin to branch off in other languages, and that's how I've gone into a bit into Dutch and Hebrew.
Hmm. That is really cool to hear about the Norman influence on Welsh because I know in some of your other videos you've talked about the Roman influence on very early Welsh, the Old Brythonic. But I of course know how much the old how the Normans changed Old English. and affected how we speak today. But I didn't know that also happened in Wales. So
Oh,
that is really cool.
they. I should highlight that with Saxon, they came in and basically created a new language in England.
Yeah.
But in Wales, it was more like a whole category of loanwords.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It didn't change the structure of the language. So that's a big difference, but it did absolutely leave a lasting mark on the language, which it didn't, as far as I'm aware, do the same to Scots Gaelic or Irish. But I would
I would,
imagine Breton down in Brittany would be very influenced by French, of course.
yeah. I mean, when I've the little bit of Breton that I've heard, it sounds so French to me. It doesn't sound very much like Welsh. But then I've not listened to a lot of it. But yeah, I think the most of the French or Latin influence on Gaelic would probably a lot of it would come through English rather than through French. It would kind of go around that way because there's a lot of loanwords from English
Oh,
in
here's one
Gaelic.
thing that's interesting about learning more than one language. When you learn another language or approach another language that's influenced by two languages that you speak, it's like, so because I have Welsh and French, when
Hmm.
I listen to a Breton speaker, my head's like bouncing back. I can't, it drives me mad. I can't digest. I keep trying to, because your mind thinks in different layers according to what language you've learned. So, for instance, when you approach a new language, you automatically delve into a language or culture that you have before. So, when I began learning Hebrew, it was so fascinating because it was so different from English or French that my mind was keeping at it, trying to go back to Welsh.
Hmm.
And which is interesting that in Hebrew, a lot of the preposition forms and that we have some things in Welsh that are in Hebrew.
Yeah, I remember seeing a video. This is a couple of years ago by Lang Focus.
Oh, he's good.
Um, yeah, and I'll put a little video up in the corner if you want to go watch it. Like the kind of weird similarities between the Celtic languages and Semitic languages, and that's always really cool to see. And in the different languages and stages of languages that I've been learning, I kind of experience that too, where whatever I'm studying, my mind, instead of going to English, usually goes to the language I studied previously in order to pick up, uh,
Yeah.
like, in order to fill in the gap. So when I was learning Spanish, it was like, what am I trying to fill it in with? Hebrew. Learn Japanese, trying to fill it in, or Gaelic, trying to fill it in with, and then the Spanish word would pop into my head. But what was it like to kind of assimilate into Welsh culture? I mean, I know you moved to England first, but then studying in Wales, and then now you've lived in several areas of Wales. You're fluent. What was that? What was that like, especially as coming from the U.S. and then now becoming this Welshman?
Well, one thing that you have to get your head around is that here in Wales, the first question almost every time, especially by Welsh speakers, is where do you come from? And they're not
Mm-hmm.
saying that because you're foreign. It's they all ask that with each other as well because the community historically it's actually a feature of the landscape almost that there's so many little valleys
Mm-hmm.
that people want to know which valley you're from so they can relate within their social register where you fit in their world. And that's completely normal if you think about the Welsh landscape like that, a series of valleys. But if you're coming from the outside in, it gets tiresome because you have to explain over and over again that you came from another country and why you learned this language and what you're doing. And I mean no offense to any native Welsh speakers or any people born here at all. It's just from an American view, that's not really. Yeah, you would ask that frequently, but it's not going to be the first question every single time. You know what I mean? So that was hard to get around. Now you asked me like, what's it like coming into Wales? I mean, Cardiff and Gwynedd, for example, where I studied, are completely different. They're still the same country. I mean, one I approached from a business standpoint, and the other I approached as a student. So very different worldviews, and very different worldviews from the people in those two places, in Gwynedd and Cardiff. One's the capital of Wales, very urban. The other one is very rural and mountainous and rugged. So one thing that I think I should mention is I'm still not really used to the climate, that it's damp and cool all the time. There's no, I mean, from a Texan's point of view, there's no summer. There's no summer.
Right.
There's spring, a slightly milder spring, autumn, and then winter. Speaking of languages, it's fascinating as well. And I spoke of the local areas, the Bröydd, BRO.YDD, Bröydd, and these little cultural areas. Every little one of those has almost like a regional language of its own in Welsh, and that takes getting used to. You can all understand each other, but if you're coming from the outside in, you should probably know that first.
I was surprised to see the more I learned Gaelic how the difference in dialect is usually just pronunciation or maybe word choice, but it's not a ton different. Whereas even from the very beginning when I started learning Welsh, it was like, oh, there's like, it seems, maybe it's just an illusion to somebody who's, still a learner, but it seems like there was a much more of a divide between like North and South Welsh, basically. Not that they're, super different. It's just at least the impression that I got.
Yeah, that's totally right. And one way I get people to understand it is, imagine if England had not come in, there would be a continuum from Cornwall way down in the southwest all the way up to Edinburgh that was the same language basically, but slowly changing all the way down. And so in South Welsh or Southwestern Welsh dialect words, you get a word syfi for strawberries. But in most of Wales, especially the north, it's mevis. But in Cornwall, it's like syfis or something like that. It's very, very similar to the dialect word in Southwestern Welsh. So, and then you get words in Breton, which are similar to Cornish. So it changes gradually, just like French used to, especially before the Revolution. And Italian still does. It changes as you move down through the country. And Welsh is no different to that. It's a variation. And I wonder how Irish is that way.
I know you talked about some of the different languages you've studied over the years. Is there a particular one that you're learning right now? Beyond just maintaining the ones you already speak.
I am focusing a bit more on French to kind of tune it up. I've been focusing so much on the YouTube channel, I haven't really had time to go into a language. The last language I really began was Hebrew and Dutch. I tried learning or beginning both of those at the same time, and I eventually fell back to Dutch because well, it's a bit easier than Hebrew from an English speaking point of view. But learning the alphabet in Hebrew was like, because people joke in Welsh that there's no vowels, and well, there are 7 more than English, but in Hebrew, really, there are no vowels. It's mind blowing now.
Yeah. I mean, if all the vowel markers are there, I can sound some stuff out in Hebrew, but if there's no vowel markers, I'm like, I'm not sure where to start. Because it's just all
Well,
consonants.
the thing I took away from Hebrew is, and this is true about most languages, I think, you need to be around people who are speaking it to
Mhm.
truly capture nuance and layered meanings. And so I kind of did my bit with a minority language learning Welsh. My point of view is now where I'm learning bigger languages because they're easy to assimilate into and have natural speakers around you. That's one of the great challenges of Welsh, but yet it's also one of the things that makes it beautiful is that not everybody can speak it, so there's something more meaningful about it in a way.
So, what motivates you to keep learning a language, even when it becomes difficult? I mean, whether that's one you've already studied or one that's new to you.
I would say if you truly want to learn a language, you're not going to focus on difficulty. It's either going to be a pleasure, a joy of your work, something that you delve into because you look forward to doing it, or it's something that's all around you, the community that you need to get by in. If it's not one of those two things, I probably wouldn't waste my time because it should either be something that you genuinely enjoy or it should be something that you need as a tool in your world. I do have a fault where I jump to a new language every once in a while before I'm fluent in a language, which I think that's a way of coping with that lack of motivation sometimes. With Welsh, there was never any lack of motivation. I was very zealous about learning the language because I found it so beautiful. But I think if you're lacking motivation in learning a language, it's probably not for you, frankly.
That's interesting. I've never heard somebody give that type of response. I guess when I get to those kind of hurdles, I try to uh, reassess my priorities or just take a break. Or I think a big one for me is like discipline over motivation. Not that motivation is not important, but that if I just try to maintain a discipline of a routine, then the motivation uh, matters less since I'm still going to be learning, even if I have a lower motivation from day to day. But
Hmm.
I really like what you said about it. It should be a pleasure. It should be something that is
Yeah,
fun, or you're zealous about it, or it's useful in some way, so that motivation is not really something you have to worry about. That makes a lot of sense to me.
yeah. I think the big thing is finding that kernel of passion and treating it like a fire that you always have to tend to keep
Mm,
it burning. Because if you let that fire of that initial passion go out, then was it really that important? I would say. And no doubt you'll have days when you're like, I'm just going to go to the beach and drink a beer or something. That's fun. We all get those days. And that's normal to not be on it like 24/7, 365 days a year. That's normal. But you do need to. Oh, I approach all things in my life where I want to get not through it, but I want to get physically with it to do
hmm
things to get. I like action, is what I'm saying. I like, and that's a lot of why I like the Celtic languages, because the verb comes first. You get to the action. You get to the action in the sentence is the first thing you deal with. Then you worry about everything else. The details in Welsh come later.
I almost think that's like a great metaphor for just language learning in general, because so many people are, especially if they're first starting out or they're, you know, they've had trouble in the past with learning a language, they're like afraid to start. And it's like, no, you just have to start. You
Yeah.
know, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to just, dive into it and find areas that you enjoy. Um, so I like that idea of it being, the verb comes first, so just do it.
Yes.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on the channel. Uh, Next, I'm going to be talking to Ben about the future of his channel and how to overcome other more difficult parts of language learning. So if you want to see that part of the interview, then click the link down below to support me on Patreon so you can get access to the rest of the interview. And then also, uh, Ben is going to interview me on his channel. So if you'd like to watch that video, you can click somewhere up here, over here, over here, over here, over here. It's here somewhere, and you can click on it and you can watch it.